They say time will heal the wounds, but
Where
these
should I be
scars just
looking?
run
At you,
too
wherever you're
deep.
going to be sitting?
Every sunrise feels the same, a promise I can't keep.
I'm not animated anymore.
Here the story starts.
Oh, yeah.
Chapter
You know, that's
torn apart.
Oh, so my entire leadership career in a global organization as a leader, I think up until the last 5 years of that career, I was always the only woman in the room. And more recently, the only time I worked for a woman is when I came to America, because this is an Irish accent you're hearing. But often I would be, when my boss wasn't in the room, then as the CEO, then I would often be the only woman in the room. So leadership meetings, the norm for me, were chaired, driven, populated by men. And now that I'm building and leading a nonprofit, that's less frequent. I haven't had an experience where I've been the only woman in the room for the last 5 years.
So for me, I think the last time I can remember would be in a classroom where teaching a technology course like CCNA, and I am the instructor, and I have all males in my classroom, maybe one female if at all. And for me, that became more of a norm when I started teaching in the community college in 2015. Most of my students were males, and sometimes you come into the classroom and you're not quite sure you're the instructor. You're like, okay, because when people are asking questions and trying to sometimes challenge what you're saying, you have to think and remind yourself that, okay, I am the instructor in here, you know? So even when you hold the power, sometimes in the room, the way it makes you feel when you're the only one, it can be intimidating, and you just have to remind yourself of who you are. So in my classroom, it was like that for many years, coming into the classroom. This is 2015, 2016. Yeah, coming into the classroom and being the only one. That's what I remember.
You know, that's an interesting question, because I have been in a lot of rooms where I am the only woman. I was in the Army for 8 years in an infantry unit where a lot of women weren't really invited to the infantry. I was their medic, so I wasn't one of the boys. And so that was probably the first room, but I want to keep it a little bit up to date. But right now I am a 24/7 detection and response team manager. Majority of my team are still men. So on a day-to-day basis, I would say that I am almost always the only woman in the room, the only maybe person of color as well. So very familiar with that setting.
Most people assume that the loneliness comes from being the only woman in the room. And I never saw it that way. For me, I was always the youngest in the room. I was from Northern Ireland when everyone else was British, or when I came to America, they were American. But I grew up at a time where they call it the Troubles, where there was a lot of problems in Northern Ireland. So there were significant biases around having an Irish accent in the mainland. So I think the things that I thought of first were my age and my accent. Probably for me were more of a conscious thing than the fact that I also happened to be a woman or a young girl. So it was there, but I think it was actually second or third order of intentional thoughts in my position. So I never thought of loneliness from that perspective, even though that's often where a question like that comes from. And then as I went on in my career, I I had a very accelerated career into leadership, and I accelerated very quickly through to some of the most senior positions in a very large organization. And I think for me, the loneliness was more about the loneliness that's shared by other people, male and female, about being at the top of an organization or being a very fast-moving, accelerated progression. So I think there's stuff that comes with being a perceived high achiever, and as somebody who reaches very senior levels very quickly. And then there's also something for men and women about being the top of your game, whether you're a CEO or as an EVP or sitting at the top of a major organization. So the loneliness for me was more associated in my mind with that trajectory and that journey than it was necessarily because I was a woman, I think.
Resilience. I learned that I have the courage to be who I am and not be afraid to respond to the situation as it comes up. And I also learned empathy. Sometimes I realize that people are not aware of the way they come off, and so, but by being able to stand your ground and ensure that people know that you are the one in charge because you are the instructor, or by being able to explain what it is that, what is not being understood, or being able to tell them that this is a place or a space where everyone, including me as the minority, will be listened to. And this is a space where everyone will be heard. So I learned about myself in terms of being able to speak up for others, speak up for myself, and being resilient when change is slow in coming.
Yeah, I learned that I can thrive in any environment that I place myself in, as long as I have my support system. So when we start talking about work, you know, there are a lot of moments where you're going to be isolated, because I felt that way. But I think we often forget the most important thing is the support system you have outside of work that drives you to succeed regardless of what that environment might feel like. So I would say that's probably the biggest lesson that I've learned. When I started, it's like a switch that I flipped in my head. You know, when I started thinking that being different, you know, having the experiences that I have, you know, being an immigrant, being a person of color, being queer, being a woman, those experiences are very unique to a small group of people, and that makes me a more well-rounded person than someone who may not be in those groups. So I would say, you know, when I flipped that switch in my head and believed in myself a little bit more, you know, rolled back my shoulders and said to myself, hey, this is who we are, this is what we have, let's kill it.
Certainly, and I put some of this down to the choices I made to exit from a corporate leadership role. I made that choice very early, semi-retired from corporate at 44, at a time when I was, by some count, some would say at the top of my game. So I made a very conscious choice to exit that life and environment. And since then, most of the positions I've been in as a consultant internationally and regionally and locally, and now building the Cyber Guild as a sustainable organization of note. My reality is I'm rarely the only woman in the room. And quite often, women are at least at a 50-50, if not even more, within the groups that I'm circling and a part of. I do go to events, obviously, in cybersecurity, where women are the minority. So that does happen, but I tend to know the women that are there, and I know a lot of the men that are there, so I feel quite comfortable in that environment because it's what I grew up in.
When I realized, I think I will say that when I realized that this can be turned into a positive thing as opposed to it being negative. When I realized that there were other students, when I started to have one or two, and they would tell me things like, I stayed in the class because you were the person, you were the instructor. Or I would hear from them when I started a club to encourage more females to be in this field on campus. They would come to me and say, oh, this is why I stayed, or this is why I was able to finish this class. I remember some years after, one of the parents brought one of their students to the club meeting, and she came in to say hello to me. She said, do you know that I was in your class in 2016 or 2017, and I only stayed in that course because you were the instructor. So things like that, statements like that, helped me realize that this here is not a disadvantage, it's actually helping some people.
Cyber Guild events, that would be unusual. Women are much more prominent as attendees, as organizers, and as speakers. That's part of what we do, is to bring everybody to the table. So it feels different because it's really different for me from what I had in my career. So it's not just I think it's real, but I'm not saying it's prevalent and real for everyone. Do I think that there isn't a challenge that we still need to resolve? Absolutely we do. I'm just working to resolve that in my own way, in my own network. So my reality is a bit different, if that makes sense.
You know, I can't really say how it was for women 10 years ago. I think there are some differences. We have more allies now. So maybe somebody said earlier today that only 17% of cyber professionals are women. While that number is still very low, I think with this shift of, feminism, I think we have a lot more allies than women did 10 years ago. So I think it has changed a little bit, but it still needs to change a lot more. But we're getting there.
It's a little bit different, not where I want it to be, but I don't feel alone in my classes anymore, because at least it's not more females, definitely, but at least I have a good number in most of the classes that I teach now. So it feels better being in that space and seeing people who look like you.
Got the story told a brighter day.
That's it? Oh, wow, okay. It wasn't too hard.